5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Happy New Year to all our listeners. It's this time of the year again, actually. I'm doing my short preview episode of some of the exciting things that may happen in and around the space sector. But first, our usual messages.
My name is Raphael Rodkin. I'm the founding partner of E2MC, Earth to Mars Capital, a venture capital investor in dozens of space startups worldwide, among other roles I have, such as being a part-time podcast host. Just as a reminder, this podcast is for informational purposes only. It does not reflect any view by E2MC, and nothing should be taken as investment advice. Before we start, a quick favor. If you do enjoy this podcast, please leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app, such as Apple or Spotify. It does help other people find the podcast. Now on to today's episode.
So, 2026 in the space sector. What are some things worth watching? We'll systematically go through that over the next 20 minutes or so. But as always, we'll start with some caveats. Just repeating the obvious, this is a preview of 2026, not a review of 2025. Forward-looking, not backward-looking. That means it's prone to error because it's partly about judgment and forecasting. But I hope that also makes it more interesting. 2025 is done and in the books. If you want a review of 2025, there are plenty out there. And frankly, these days, you can just go to your favorite large language model. However, if an event is on the 2026 preview and had already been on the 2025 preview and maybe even 2024, I may mention that. Second caveat. I just can't cover everything. The following are just some highlights. And that is, in a way, a positive message. There's just too much going on in the space sector by now to fit into one episode. I know some of you listening are actually space entrepreneurs, and your most exciting 2026 event may be your big 2026 milestone, like a in-orbit demonstration. And that is the way it should be, and I wish you best of luck on those. Sorry if I'm not covering them explicitly here. If you think they are super interesting for our listeners to hear about, please do reach out and apply to be a guest for a separate episode. Lastly, all of the following is woefully underrepresenting things going on in China. That is arguably true for a lot of space reporting in general, if not all of it. I'll try to increasingly fix that going forward. So let's run through the annual preview by major categories, as usual, but also in no particular order. Let's start with launch or rockets. And these are also in no particular order. Around the world, there are a number of launches that were already on the 2025 and sometimes even earlier lists with regard to trying for orbital launch. Let's start with the few ones that actually did try in 2025, but ended up with an anomaly. Australia's Gilmore Space launched its Eris hybrid rocket from Queensland in July 2025, but the rocket experienced an anomaly and crashed after about 14 seconds flight time. Germany's ESA Aerospace's Spectrum rocket took off from the Norwegian Andøya spaceport on March 30th, 2025, but lost attitude control after roughly 30 seconds of flight and crashed back. And at the very end of last year, just a few days ago, on December 22nd, South Korea's InnoSpace tried to launch its Hanbit Nano rocket from Brazil's Alcântara Space Launch Center. That flight went awry after about 30 seconds too. All three of these companies are expected to try again in 2026. Next are the rocket companies that were on the 2025 list, but did not end up trying for an orbital launch during the year in the end, but hopefully will in 2026. In the US, we have Rocket Lab's Neutron, a rocket capable of taking 13 tons to LEO. It was on the 2025 preview, but that time frame was known to be aggressive, and we had pointed that out. Best of luck for the maiden launch, hopefully in 2026. And we also have Astra with its Rocket 4. In Europe, there are a few. France's Maya Space with its equally named Maya rocket from French Guiana. Spain's PLD with its Miura 5, also from French Guiana. PLD has already successfully had a suborbital launch, by the way. Also from Germany, we have RFA with its RFA-1, who will try to launch from the Saxavord spaceport in the Shetland Islands. Orbex from the UK with its Prime rocket will also try from Saxavord. And also from Saxavord, there is Skyrora, also from the UK, and they may try with their XL rocket. They have had a suborbital attempt previously. In India, we have Agnikul and Skyroot with the Agniban and Vikram rockets, respectively. And both companies have already successfully launched suborbitally. Then we should mention a few companies that indeed were not expected to try until 2026, but I'm very excited for them to do so now. So there's Relativity Space, acquired by Eric Schmidt during 2025 with its Terran R rocket. And Firefly and Northrop Grumman may try to launch their new Eclipse medium-lift rocket. And last but definitely not least, Stoke Space with its fully reusable Nova rocket. Now for some rockets that have already launched successfully but are worth watching. ULA will want to launch its Vulcan much more frequently, substantially for helping to deploy the Amazon LEO constellation and also for the US Space Force. Blue Origin's New Glenn heavy launcher with 45 tons payload capacity to low Earth orbit launched twice successfully during 2025. On the second attempt, they successfully landed the booster stage on a drone ship, joining a hyper-exclusive club that had previously only one member, SpaceX. The question now is how quickly can they ramp up flight cadence? In a recent interview, Blue Origin CEO Dave Limb mentioned they're capable of building about one New Glenn rocket a month, and he thinks double-digit launches will be possible. Given how big this rocket is, if that happens, Blue Origin may become perhaps the number 3 entity in the world by mass brought to space, behind only SpaceX in China. Which brings us, of course, to SpaceX, and more specifically to Starship. Progress on this massive, fully reusable vehicle is even more important in 2026 than before, given the potential SpaceX IPO, about which we shall speak in a few minutes. But independent of any IPO, Starship is key to the continued growth of SpaceX's Starlink satellite communications business and also to NASA's lunar plans, given its role as one of the options for the Human Landing System, or HLS. The next Starship test flight, number 12, should happen soon, maybe in January or February. SpaceX will probably want to have many, I'm guessing maybe monthly Starship test flights during the year, as there are key things to be tested and ultimately proven, notably propellant transfer in space, which is critical for getting to Mars and to the moon, and catching the Starship upper stage back at the launch tower, which is critical for full and rapid reusage. Next, we'll talk about the moon, because 2026 may be a very significant year for lunar things. First and foremost, there's the looming Artemis 2 mission, a crewed circumlunar flight, not a landing yet, and the first time that humans would leave Earth's orbit since 1972. This may happen as early as February. That's the only crewed mission, but just like last year, there are a bunch of uncrewed missions scheduled for 2026. We have Firefly with Blue Ghost 2. Remember that Firefly's Blue Ghost 1 lander became the first successful commercial landing on the moon last year. Blue Origin's Mark 1 lander in the company's first attempt to go to the moon, Astrobotic with its Griffin 1 lander, and Intuitive Machines' IM-3 mission with its Nova C lander. This will be Intuitive Machines' third attempt after the first two both had its landers tip over and fail to achieve their full mission objectives. By the way, these are all quite different sizes of landers. Nova C and Blue Ghost are around 100 to 150 kilogram capacity. Griffin has a few hundred kilograms, but Blue Origin's Mark 1 has several tons. Outside the US, we have iSpace from Japan, also going to try for the third time. After its first two attempts, both had hard landings. This attempt, however, will be with a different lander called Apex 1, developed by its US subsidiary jointly with Draper. And from China, Chang'e 7, which will feature a rover and some sort of hopping probe to explore craters around the lunar South Pole. Besides landers, we expect to hear about the final selection for NASA's multi-billion-dollar lunar terrain vehicle contract very soon. The companies in the running are Astrolab, Intuitive Machines, and Lunar Outpost. Second topic, space stations. The key potential event here, and a really exciting one, is Vast's plan to launch its Haven 1 first space station. That would be the first commercial space station ever. If all goes well, 4 astronauts would then launch soon after in order to stay on the new station. The other commercial companies working on space stations will not launch anything in 2026, and neither will any sovereign nation like India or Russia, for example. Also watch for any Space Act agreements awards to any of the CLD, commercial LEO destination, contenders, the companies aiming to replace the ISS. And somewhat related to space stations is the group of companies focusing on so-called downmass. That's our next topic. And downmass is bringing stuff back from space to Earth as opposed to the better known other way around, which is called upmass. There are now a number of downmass companies around the world, and some will try for missions in 2026. The best known of these companies, Vada Space from the US, flew 4 times in 2025 and will likely try to fly even more often in 2026, including a mission where 2 of its capsules launch at the same time on a Falcon 9. The Sierra Space Dream Chaser spaceplane has been on our list of maiden flights since 2024. Maybe 2026 will be the year to see it happen. Now changed to an orbital flight without any ISS docking. Germany's Atmos may try a second orbital test flight of its Phoenix capsule for in-space experimentation and manufacturing. And we may see first demonstration missions from other similar companies, including, for example, Inversion Space and Outpost Space in the US and Elevation Space in Japan. Lastly, Boeing's Starliner is scheduled to have an uncrewed supply flight to the International Space Station. Since Starliner is also designed to fly crew, though, that's a nice segue into human spaceflight. Regular crew rotations on the International Space Station will, of course, continue independent of Starliner on Dragon and Soyuz capsules. Axiom is expected to continue its private missions to the ISS with AX-5 in 2026. The Chinese will do similar astronaut rotation flights to their own Tiangong space station. And a long shot, probably not this year, but it would be a first flight within India's Gaganyaan crewed program. But we already mentioned the top crewed mission in 2026 when we talked about the moon, Artemis 2. I suspect in terms of public attention, nothing will even come remotely close. We also already mentioned that VAST is planning to fly astronauts to its Haven 1 station once it's up in orbit. Lastly, suborbital flights will surely continue on Blue Origin's New Shepard, and maybe we'll see first flights on Virgin Galactic's new Delta-class vehicle. Let's now touch upon some space applications. First, satellite communications, still by far the top revenue generator for the entire space sector. We shall continue to watch the growth at Starlink, which recently reached 9 million global subscribers. That Starlink growth story is very important for the potential SpaceX IPO, about which we'll talk in a few minutes. But 2026 should also see the commercial launch of Amazon Leo, the broadband service formerly known as Amazon Kuiper. The good news for Amazon is that there are now finally several launch vehicles operationally ready to build out their constellation, such as New Glenn, Vulcan, and Ariane 6. Also in the build-out phase of constellations in 2026 is AST Space Mobile with its direct-to-device constellation. Dozens of satellite deployments are expected. Beyond the US, expect potentially significant build-out of the Chinese mega constellations for satellite communications, such as Thousand Sails and Guowang. Telesat in Canada, with its Lightspeed broadband constellation, is at a much earlier stage and may launch the first Pathfinder satellites during the year. Also from Canada, Kepler Communications plans to launch its first 10 optical data relay satellites. Lastly, will we see more spectrum deals like SpaceX's monster acquisition of EchoStar spectrum in 2025? We'll see. Anyway, onto Earth observation. I frankly don't have much here, but 4 things I will continue to watch, as I already did last year, are hyperspectral, any developments, including commercial traction, at the various hyperspectral satellite operators such as Pixel and Planet. Consolidation, signs of further consolidation within this still quite fragmented subsector. Sovereign Earth observation constellations, is that trend going to continue? And VLEO, or very low Earth orbit, as there are now a few startups trying to target this orbit for EO use. There will also be some government missions deploying new Earth observation satellites, including Italy's Cosmos SkyMed synthetic aperture radar one. On the other hand, NASA is scheduled to decommission its 3 flagship satellites of the Earth observing system. Some other things I'll be watching within space applications, specifically whether there is any visible technical progress, for example via demonstration missions. Orbital data centers, the hot topic of the day. Space-based solar power, with companies like Etherflux and Overview Space working on it. Hypersonic vehicles, perennial defense favorite. GNSS, or navigation. Will companies like Zona start deploying their commercial constellation? Also in Japan, they'll complete their sovereign QZSS constellation. That's it for the things I had on the docket for commercial space. So now let's shift to space science missions. And that's leaving aside the lunar ones that we already discussed. China's Tianwen-2 mission is expected to arrive at the Kamo-Oa-Leva asteroid and try to grab samples of it. The Bepi-Colombo mission, a joint ESA-JAXA project, is scheduled to arrive and enter orbit around Mercury in November 2026. And Japan's JAXA wants to launch the MMX mission, which stands for Martian Moons Exploration, and wants to, well, explore the Martian moons, Deimos and Phobos. On Phobos, it even wants to deploy a rover and grab a sample. ESA's Plato may launch towards the end of the year in order to find Earth-like planets. Already on the list last year and the year before was Rocket Lab's Venus Life Finder. On to the next topic, government. In the US, I think there are at least 3 important things to watch during 2026. First, Jared Isaacman at NASA. How will the new administrator reshape America's space agency? This includes potential decisions on Artemis, other marquee missions like the Mars sample return, and frankly, much, much more. Second, the recent executive order on ensuring American space superiority that was signed at the end of 2025. How will that executive order translate into practical steps in 2026? Remember that besides going back to the moon and replacing the ISS, that executive order had other interesting elements, like enabling space nuclear power. Third, actually mentioned in the executive order, but definitely worth pointing out separately, the American Golden Dome. Will there be any contract awards, tests, other notable developments around the plan for a nationwide missile defense shield? Some initial contract awards have apparently been made in late 2025, but the names of the companies were not disclosed. Many companies are starting to position themselves for this program because it may funnel hundreds of billions or maybe even trillions into the space sector. For example, satellite bus company Apex Space from Los Angeles announced last year that they will conduct a self-funded test for space-based interceptors stationed on one of their satellite platforms. And this test may happen in 2026. It's called Project Shadow. And there's also stuff that has been going on for years and it is worth continuing watching. For example, the SDA, the Space Development Agency in the US, is expected to launch Tranche 2 of its so-called proliferated warfighter space architecture. Tranche 1 may achieve initial warfighting capability this year, but maybe that'll be in 2027. So far on the government side, that's all in the US, of course. Outside the US, we shall watch, among other things, how the European Space Agency will spend the record budget it just got approved at the end of 2025. Now let's talk about finance, funding, investments, money stuff. Last year, we talked about a potential SpaceX Starlink IPO in this section. Well, this now obviously has to be updated for the potential IPO of the entire company, all of SpaceX, and a valuation of $1.5 trillion has been mentioned. The key point from last year remains true though, and even more so. Such an IPO would turn paper gains of SpaceX investors into enormous real gains, at least some of which may get reinvested in the space sector. Furthermore, the excitement and spotlighting of the sector that a SpaceX IPO would create may well create a strong rising tide that would lift all space boats. Add to this the government tailwinds we just discussed. In the back of all of this, and also considering that in 2025 we actually had several space IPOs that arguably went off reasonably well, that may mean that in 26 we may see many further IPOs of space companies. And in fact, satellite manufacturer York Space has already filed for such an IPO in the US. There are clearly several other candidates that have private market valuations in the billions of dollars. And over in China, Landspace, a launch company, has also announced it will IPO on the Shanghai Stock Exchange to raise about $1 billion. I also expect mergers and acquisitions in the space sector to continue, and this will likely include smaller deals like larger space players buying up specific capabilities and technologies to strengthen their supply chain, but there may also be larger deals. One item that remains on the list from previous years is the future of launch company ULA. And we already mentioned potential spectrum deals when we talked about satellite communications. Okay, usually we finish up on events. But frankly, there are too many space events now, so I will only mention a few, either because they're new or very prominent. In Singapore, we will have a new space event, the Singapore Space Summit, first week of February. It's essentially a new vertical of the well-known Singapore Air Show. Also in February, but the third week, will be the new Space Next conference in Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. And also in Washington, D.C., there will be the new Reuters Space and Satellite USA event, second week of June. And among existing events, the biggest annual space conference, the International Astronautical Congress, or IAC, this year will be held in Antalya, Turkey in early October. And that's a wrap for my 2026 in space preview. Lastly, let me repeat something I said for the last years. I'm more excited about space than ever, even more so than last year and the year before. Among other reasons, this is because of the potential SpaceX IPO and also the incoming NASA leadership under Jared Isaacman. The time to build and invest is now. If you're new to the space sector, there are now quite a few resources around for you. I just talked about events you can go to. There's a range of educational programs, both in person and online, including some of my own courses. And this very podcast has another around 160 episodes that you may find useful. So again, the time to build and invest in space is now. Let's fucking do it. Happy 2026. And that's it for another nominal episode of the Space Business Podcast. And once more, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, such as Apple or Spotify. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. We're also on LinkedIn under the Space Business Podcast. Lastly, if you have any feedback, including ideas for guests, and that may even include yourself if you have an exciting space story to tell, or are interested in becoming a sponsor, or really for any other suggestions, you can drop us an email at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and see you for the next episode.